If you enjoy Scary Interesting, odds are that you enjoy stories of humanity surviving, or sometimes not, in some of the most difficult conditions on Earth. So today I want to introduce you to one of these stories, which is a horror fiction podcast and YouTube channel set within the chilling polar night of Svalbard called The White Vault. It's an audio story similar to Scary Interesting, but with a full voice cast where an international rescue and repair team is sent to discover the source of a mysterious signal at a remote Arctic research station. On their mission, they become trapped when the weather takes a turn for the worst, and they also make a number of shocking discoveries lurking beneath the ice. What makes the White Vault particularly unsettling, though, is that you feel like you're actually with the team as they march through the sunless Arctic snowscape. The creators of the show also go through great pains to ensure the scientific, linguistic, oral, and cultural accuracy. You can hear languages like Icelandic, Arabic, Portuguese, Mandarin, and even endangered languages like Manchu and Yiddish. The White Vault also features actual audio from endangered species like polar bears and Andean condors. The complete story is also now available, so you can hear all of the collected records for free without having to wait on new releases. A new season is also available on Spotify, which follows a pair of nature photographers in rural Maine. There are also several other seasons which follow stories that would be right here at home on Scary Interesting, like an archaeology team that survives an avalanche in Patagonia, and spin-off series in the Antarctic, England, Japan, and 18th century China. And by the way, the feedback that I've seen both in my comment section and their comment section since the first time they sponsored a video has been fantastic. So I'd highly recommend you head on over to their YouTube channel or find them wherever you listen to podcasts to delve into the waiting horrors. On April 5th, 1999, a guy named Robert, his brother, and a friend of theirs spent the night camped near a cave named Hermit Cave. The three of them were in the area to do some wilderness activities and try out caving for the first time. Hermit Cave is located somewhere in the Woodland Park area near Fort Gibson Lake in Oklahoma, but unfortunately I couldn't find the exact location. Honestly though, with how this story ends, it's probably a good thing the cave isn't more well known. 200 million years ago, Oklahoma and the surrounding area were covered by water as part of an ancient sea. Over time, the water receded and evaporated, leaving behind huge deposits of minerals. Then, in addition to that, other geological processes pushed the underlying layer of gypsum close to the surface. Gypsum is a fairly soft and easily dissolved mineral, so over time, water covered out tunnels to form the caves present in Oklahoma and the surrounding area. Because of the leftover mineral deposits, some of these have large and beautiful crystal formations within them. Hermit Cave, however, is almost the exact opposite. The cave entrance is little more than a dirt-covered opening 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, and the rest of it is just as unimpressive. After spending the night camped nearby, the friend that was with Robert and his brother had to leave to go to work, but rather than leave with him, Robert and his brother wanted to do some exploring. In particular, although this was his first time caving, Robert wanted to go into Hermit Cave and see how far it went. But also, because this was his first time caving, Robert didn't really know what he was doing. It just seemed like a fun thing to do. This meant he also wasn't all that prepared and was just wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He also only had one flashlight, no helmet, and no backup lights. He also likely didn't know about the bad air present within the cave. This occurs when a cave has poor circulation and the air inside isn't safe to breathe for long periods of time. But either way, after squeezing through the small opening, Robert and his brother continued on through the increasingly tight passages. Eventually, Robert went through a small side passage that seemed to narrow even further. Then he got 50 feet in, then 100 feet in, and it was becoming so tight it was hard to even take a full breath. Then at 150 feet in, there was a restriction that was the smallest point they'd gotten to so far. From Robert's vantage point, the tunnel seemed to angle downward to the squeeze and then widen out again afterward. So after thinking about it for a moment, he decided to try to squeeze through it. Head first, he pushed his body forward with his arms at his sides as the tunnel squeezed him tighter and tighter. After some struggle, Robert came to a stop and realized he was fully wedged. It was too tight to continue forward, and because of the angle and because his arms are pinned by his sides, he didn't have enough leverage to push himself backward. Even worse, he was stuck with his face right above the wet, muddy floor of the cave. After trying desperately to free himself with no luck, his brother tried as well, but either couldn't reach him or just couldn't pull him out. So with no other options, his brother was forced to leave to go get help, leaving Robert in this inverted position. Rescue teams and paramedics arrived shortly afterward, and Robert's brother led them to the little dirt opening. Then, over the next several hours, the teams worked to remove dirt and rocks to widen the area enough to reach Robert to get him out. The entire time they were doing this as well, air had to be pumped into the cave because of how bad the air quality was inside. On top of that, even the thinnest paramedic to enter the cave couldn't even take full breaths part of the way to the restriction. Finally, they would reach Robert at 3 p.m., 5 hours after he'd gotten stuck, and tragically, he was dead. He was face down in the mud and seemed to have died of suffocation. His body was eventually pulled out of the cave, but it's not clear if he passed out due to the poor air quality or if he just couldn't hold himself up anymore out of the mud. The tallest, most prominent, and probably the most impressive mountain in the Canadian Rockies is Mount Robson, standing at almost 13,000 feet or 4,000 meters. A few miles east of Mount Robson is another mountain named Trio Mountain, which is far less impressive in height. However, it's not the mountain itself that's impressive, it's what's inside of it. The closest and only road running through this incredibly remote stretch of mountains is the Yellowhead Highway. The highway itself sits at 3,000 feet elevation, then another almost 4,000 feet up from there, on the side of Trio Mountain is the opening to the second deepest cave in Canada, named Artemis Cave. At 1,760 feet deep, or 536 meters deep, it's also one of the deepest caves anywhere on Earth. And not only is it massive in size, but it's also incredibly difficult to get to. On foot, it's a 20-kilometer hike through forests and around mountains from the highway, which is usually done over several days. This makes flying in by helicopter the most efficient, but obviously, for most, that's prohibitively costly. On top of that, although Artemis may be famous for its depth, that's only part of what makes it difficult. The descent to the bottom is broken up in two sections, and the very first cavers have to traverse is known as the Endless Climb. Much of this section is either extremely steep or completely vertical shafts. The cave does level out the deeper you go, but either way, this means cavers have to rappel down what are essentially cliff faces inside a cave. Many of these are also filled with ice-cold runoff from the surrounding mountains and glaciers. On the afternoon of October 17, 1991, Rick Black, Chris Zimmerman, Hugo Mullick, and Ron Lassell readied themselves to be airlifted to the entrance of Artemis Cave. Rick, Chris, and Hugo were seasonal rangers at Mount Robson Provincial Park, and all four of the men were experienced cavers. After the helicopter dropped the men off outside the entrance to Artemis Cave, they wasted little time in getting the base camp set up. Then they split into two groups. First, Rick and Chris entered. Then, 3 hours later, Ron and Hugo followed, and they all planned to meet up later on. For the next few hours, they would work their way deeper and deeper into the earth. When they reached a depth of around 1,300 feet or 400 meters at 11:30 that night, they arrived at a vertical shaft called the Refresher. At about 29 feet between the ledge of the Refresher to the floor below, it's not the most intimidating drop in the entire cave, but what does make it tricky though is the full-on frigid waterfall that cavers have to rappel down and then climb back up through. It's almost impossible to get through without getting soaked. Either way, once secured, they descended the Refresher one at a time. Then once they were at the bottom, they went to descend the next section. When it was Rick's turn, he grabbed hold of the rope, performed a final safety check, and inched his way across the ledge. Then, a moment after the rope went taut with the full weight of Rick's body on one end, it went slack. What Rick didn't know was that what he had tied the rope to wasn't bedrock, it was actually an unstable 400-kilogram boulder. So when he started to move, his weight caused the boulder to come free and then slide down on top of him. Rick's pelvis was then crushed by the boulder and he was knocked unconscious. The others quickly rushed to Rick's aid, and to their relief, he was alive, but the pain of his injuries was intense and he was slurring his words when he came to. They weren't sure the full extent of his injuries, but his pelvis was likely broken at the very least. There was no chance he was getting out under his own power. Because they were avid cavers, the men were knowledgeable in first aid, but Rick needed much more serious medical attention. They really had just two options. They could try to carry Rick out, or two of them could leave in search of help, while the other stayed with Rick in the cave. At first, they tried to carry him, but they only moved him a few feet before he screamed for them to stop. Without a proper stretcher, there was no way they could get him out without causing more damage. So, with nothing else to do, they had to split up. Chris stayed with Rick, and then Hugo and Ron left to get help. It's difficult to put into perspective just how daunting of a mission this was. Some caves had parking lots right outside the entrance, but getting out of Artemis was only part of the battle. The only fast way on or off the mountain was by helicopter, but Hugo and Ron didn't have any way to get in touch with the pilot. Their emergency radio also failed to make contact with the tower, so in order to call emergency services, they would need to climb out of the cave, then walk the 20 kilometers to the highway and flag someone down. Just getting back to the entrance took almost 5 hours. Then when they finally reached the highway, 14 hours had passed since they left Rick and Chris, and they had walked through the forest all night. After Hugo and Ron left, Chris huddled next to Rick to keep him as warm as possible. Temperatures at that depth were freezing, and it was only a matter of time before they got hypothermic. Making things worse, they were in pitch blackness. To preserve their light as much as possible, both men turned their headlamps off and listened to the water pouring around them. There was little more they could do other than shiver and wait for help to arrive. As soon as the RCMP were alerted to Rick's ordeal on the afternoon of October 18th, they mobilized on multiple fronts. The provincial government sent 3 planes to Vancouver Island to pick up cavers with rescue training to assist in the effort to save Rick. Recreational cavers also drove in from all over to offer their help too. At first light on the morning of October 19th, almost 36 hours after the incident, a helicopter dropped off the first rescuers and then returned to pick up more. While some rescue personnel were being transported, others set up a large headquarters with tents in the valley below the cave. Unfortunately, Rick and Chris were oblivious to how much activity was going on outside the cave to reach them, and hope was fading on the morning of the 19th. Their shivering had gotten much worse, and by then, Chris, who was completely uninjured, was deteriorating right alongside Rick. About 30 hours into this, Rick turned to Chris and urged him to leave the cave. If things kept going like this, they'd both be dead within hours. Chris initially protested, but Rick insisted he leave while he still had enough in him to make it to the entrance. He had to think about it for a moment, but reluctantly, Chris gathered up his gear and told Rick that he'd be back for him with help to bring him home. Sometime around midday, Chris spotted headlamps in the tunnel ahead of him. The first group of rescuers were a fair distance into the cave already, and they rushed to Chris when they saw him. Chris then told them he was fine and provided more information about Rick's condition before continuing on to the cave entrance. Then, finally that afternoon, Chris appeared at the entrance of the cave and was immediately tended to. Emergency personnel stabilized him before he was airlifted to a nearby hospital to be treated for hypothermia. Around the same time, rescuers carrying medical equipment, heating pads, and dry clothing finally made it to Rick, but they were too late. Rick died shortly before their arrival. The news eventually made its way through to the rescue team, and many burst into tears. Since the caving community is relatively small, many of them knew Rick well. After the initial shock of Rick's death passed and the rescue became a recovery mission, search and rescue would need another 2 days for several teams of 10 to carry Rick's body out of Artemis Cave. An autopsy was then performed, and the coroner determined that there was no scenario in which Rick would survive the ordeal. The moment that rock slipped, his fate was sealed. The boulder had caused catastrophic damage to Rick's body, including many of his major organs. Even with immediate medical attention at a well-equipped hospital, the result would have been the same. The autopsy also showed that Rick's cause of death were the injuries he suffered and not hypothermia, like many of the rescuers thought was the case. To this day, the rescue within Artemis Cave is the most extensive in Canadian history. More than 1,000 years ago, a group of Native Americans from the Timbisha Shoshone tribe wandered into the Mojave Desert and decided to stay. This desert is located across much of the southern portions of California and Nevada, and the arid and sweltering climate there is an interesting choice of place to settle, to say the least. However, despite this, the people thrived in this often hostile environment. So much so that around 300 of their descendants can still be found in the area today. Right along the border of California and Nevada, in a section of the Mojave once inhabited by this tribe, sits a strange geological feature surrounded by barren desert on all sides. From high above, it looks like a small crack in a cliffside, but from down below, it's more like a chasm. It widens to be about 8 feet wide and 60 feet in length, and at the bottom is a crystal clear geothermal pool. And the natives who knew of this pool would tell their children a legend about what they called water babies that lived inside this water. Supposedly, if the children swam for too long in the water, they'd become a meal for one of these water babies. Some of the elders even said that the pool was the entrance to a network of tunnels that mystical shamans used to travel from place to place in the desert. Modern-day studies and findings have found more natural explanations for its existence, but even still, so much about the pool, known today as Devil's Hole, is still unknown. And this mystery and the descriptions of its underwater beauty in newspapers in the 1960s is exactly what drew the fascination of Paul Giancontieri. Paul was a 19-year-old cafeteria worker at a Nevada test site for nuclear devices and often talked with friends about Devil's Hole and how much he wanted to dive in. And about a year after he first learned about it, he finally got his chance. Paul managed to convince his friends, 20-year-old David Rose, 19-year-old Bill Alter, and his brother, 20-year-old Jack Alter, to join him. Then on June 20th, 1965, the four of them made the 90-mile trip to Devil's Hole. Now, Devil's Hole isn't just some natural, untouched spring that you can take a leisurely swim in. It's actually a restricted area that was surrounded by just a fence in the 1960s, but today it's much more protected for several reasons. Devil's Hole is unlike anywhere else in the world. It's believed that it could be the deepest cave in the world, and at one time it was thought to be an entryway to an underground ocean. In fact, just the water contained within it is historically significant. Water flows into Devil's Hole through a long network of underground tunnels from the area of the desert where nuclear weapons were tested. And Devil's Hole is one of the endpoints of all this water. The slow-moving underground water that starts as rain or snow near the test site slowly makes its way to Devil's Hole over the course of 15,000 years. So as a result of the nuclear tests, radioactive water will begin to fill the hole in another 15,000 years. Weirdly as well, it's also some sort of natural detector of seismic activity. Earthquakes that occur in the Western Hemisphere and as far away as Asia cause mini tsunamis about 15 minutes later at the entrance to the pool, and no one knows why. The biggest reason for protecting Devil's Hole, however, funny enough, is just a tiny little fish known as the Devil's Hole pupfish. These bright blue inch-long fish are found in the water in the hole and only in the water in the hole. Some experts theorize the pupfish have been there for at least 20,000 years, but how they got there is unclear. Either way, they spawn in the shallow limestone entrance to the pool and live their entire lives between the surface and 80 feet deep, feeding on the small amount of algae that grows in the rocks in the water. To ensure the pupfish would be protected forever, President Harry Truman added the expanse around Devil's Hole to the Death Valley National Park in 1952. Then, during the early 1960s, a professional diver named Jim Houts was given permission to perform a series of dives at Devil's Hole to explore what was beneath the surface. Jim then mapped out what he saw during those dives and began piecing together the most comprehensive understanding of the layout of the tunnels available. During this, he found that around 100 feet or 30 meters, the large main chamber turns into a tight restriction known as the funnel. Then once through it, divers enter an area known as Ackrey's Chasm. This chamber is massive. It's around 300 feet long and 40 feet wide, and off to one side has several vertical tubes that lead to air pockets close to the surface. The floor of this chamber is also concave and dips deeper and deeper into a hole just wide enough for a diver with air tanks to fit through. And since the hole narrows as it descends, there is a downward current that gets stronger and stronger the deeper you go. During his exploration, Jim went as far as he could, but never did find the true bottom of Devil's Hole. His discoveries, however, were groundbreaking and covered extensively by the media as a result. This is how Paul came to learn about Devil's Hole. It was Jim's descriptions of the shimmering, colorful rock walls of the main chamber that influenced Paul to plan a dive there. The thing is, Paul was not a professional diver. He wasn't even much of a diver at all. The only thing that could be considered a plan was the decision to go there. Everything else was an afterthought. Loading up their equipment for the trip consisted of tossing a couple of old air tanks, masks, snorkels, and flashlights into a car, so this wasn't exactly a sophisticated trip. When the group arrived in the vicinity of Devil's Hole after sundown, they parked the car along Devil's Hole Road, grabbed what little gear they brought, and started the short walk to the desert chasm. Just over a bluff, Devil's Hole and its surrounding fence came into view, as did the warning signs warning visitors to keep out. Unfortunately, the four men didn't even notice them as they scaled the fence and walked down to the edge of the pool. Paul, David, and Bill then stripped down to their bathing suits and started to enter the pool near the shallow limestone shelf so critical to the pupfish. Once they were there as well, Jack decided not to join them and would instead keep a lookout at the surface in case anyone spotted them. After some playful teasing of Jack for backing out, the other three slipped under the water's surface. For Paul, the descent was everything Jim described to reporters. Since they needed the cover of darkness to pull this off, the sunlight reflecting off the colorful walls was absent, but they were still breathtaking in the flashlight beams. After exploring for a bit, Bill's tank showed that his air supply was much lower than anticipated for the amount of time they were underwater. He then got Paul and David's attention and did his best to communicate through gestures that he needed to return to the surface. They seemed to understand, and then all three started their descent. David surfaced a little after midnight, and Bill was right behind him. They stayed in the water as they excitedly told Jack what it was like down there, but they soon noticed that Paul had not only not resurfaced, but there was no sign of him at all. There were no bubbles, no faint beam of light deeper down, just nothing. At first, they figured Paul may have changed his mind during ascent and had enough air to stay longer, but David and Paul didn't want to take a chance anyway. Suddenly panicked that their friend might be in trouble, they frantically descended into the water again. As they got farther from the water surface, they got more and more anxious. There were still no bubbles coming out from below them, and there were no signs of Paul's light anywhere. It was all darkness. Then when they reached the 175-foot mark, Bill had to rush back to the surface. He didn't have enough air to go any further, and he might not have even had enough to make it back. Without signaling David, Bill started an immediate ascent. Then when he popped out of the water at the surface, Bill and Jack looked at each other and knew without saying a word that this was bad. And the situation was bad enough with Paul missing, but after waiting at the surface for a while for David, they realized he wasn't coming back either. Bill then hurried out of the water and ran back to the car with Jack, and with no other option, they sped southeast down a desolate desert road 90 miles to Las Vegas. Before sunup on June 21st, the search and rescue team from the Sheriff's Department and several Death Valley National Park rangers started to arrive at Devil's Hole. When they learned about the emergency, police made a phone call to a diver they knew could find the missing man, and that person was Jim. The same man who inadvertently and unintentionally inspired the men to be down there at all was now charged with finding them. Jim then organized the divers and assigned roles to each of them before a handful of them descended into Devil's Hole. Meanwhile, members of Paul and David's family started showing up at Devil's Hole shortly afterward too. And as if the whole situation needed any more tragedy, Paul and David had officially joined the same family just a few months earlier. David married Paul's sister, and the two friends had been adjusting to life as brothers-in-law. By then, Paula stood crying outside of Devil's Hole with the growing prospect of losing her brother and husband at the same time. For the next 36 straight hours, Jim and 44 rescue divers searched non-stop for Paul and David. Unfortunately, all they found were a mask and snorkel as well as a flashlight tied to a rock around the 100-foot mark, likely as an indicator of which way the exit was. Tragically, neither of the men seemed to have found this indicator. During one of these dives as well, Jim and his partner dropped a depth line, which is a line with a weight on it. Apparently, this line got to a depth of 932 feet without ever touching a bottom. Jim then named this section the Infinity Room, but the two decided not to explore it because of the depth, small entrance, and the strong current flowing into it. Finally, the search was called off on the evening of June 22nd, and almost 60 years later, their bodies have still never been found. If you made it this far, thanks so much for tuning in. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. And once again, a huge thank you to the White Vault for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out using the link in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.